Thank you, Sumi, and I would like to thank the Department of Gender Studies and the Global School of Sustainability for inviting me here to speak to you all, and for all of you for coming here on this November evening to discuss this not so modest project of remaking the globe. Not so modest, but much needed in face of the many crises we're confronted with today, of biodiversity loss, of war, violence, authoritarian politics, and climate change. In fact, we live now in times when human life on the planet is itself in threat. Sustainability is often presented as an answer, a balance between the economy, society, and environment, with justice at its core. But what does it really take to do sustainability right with justice? And what it takes and how, and this is basically what I'm going to talk about today. So while sustainability is everywhere in policy language, action that deals with these many crises, and especially that addresses justice, remains frustratingly absent. For example, take the EU's green transition and the just transition plans. A quick look at the websites, like at the screen shot, will show you that current crises will be solved with new green technologies and economic instruments. Society, as we social scientists know it, gendered, unequal, threatened, doesn't exist in these plans. Given that even the IPCC has stated that to be sustainable, we need to address colonial legacies and injustices. But for me, I feel there's also frustration with people like me, critical scholars whose work seems to make little practical change on the ground. Some of us have called to jettison current structures altogether, and as you can see, this is also the case with the Sustainable Development Goals that are seen to reproduce unjust systems based on a Western and neoliberal mind frame. The alternative, though, is a bit diffuse and fuzzy. Many call for local action, but these calls have had marginal effect again. They run a parallel course with mainstream decision making. So what would disengagement with current structures look like for our thinking and practice, and how can that happen, given that we too constitute these structures actually in our everyday in ways that are both big and small? So my talk today is going to focus on what we can do from where we are to conceptualize and act for change, given the structures that we do live and work within. While a de-linking from oppressive global structures is needed for change, I would like to explore with you and discuss with you how we might redeploy those structures and not just disengage. So going beyond epistemological critiques of global development and climate interventions, my question is, how can we conceptualize and take practical action to create new worlds that are gender just and equal by remaking what we already have? So paraphrasing the philosopher Nelson Goodman, I would say that world making as we know it must start not from nothing, but from the worlds that are already at hand. The remaking is making, or also as the human geographer Chantal Carr writes, it is society that is broken, not just the climate. Society needs repairing. Yet, and this I think is important, we need to do the repairing by drawing on the resources that society has, the skills that people know, many of which are ignored. So to think this through, I've divided the talk in 3 parts. I begin with the conceptual underpinnings of my talk, that is with post and decolonial critiques of what have been called Western ways of thinking and working, in particular the concepts of the globe, but also sustainability. 2 words that are also central in LSE's new institute. I examine these in the light of the entangled worlds in which we live and the difficulties, I think, of separating what is Western and non-Western, and how we can think of justice in these contexts. In the second part of the talk, I describe fragments from my research on carbon forestry in countries in Africa, and Burkina Faso and Tanzania in particular, Swedish policy and practice on gender and democracy at home in Sweden, and also in their development aid. And lastly, the green transition in Sweden. In all, I show how the idea of the globe is mobilized in practice today and its implications for sustainability. I end with using the fragments to think through how we might conceptualize new worlds with justice. So first, the idea of the globe. The idea of the globe is, as post and decolonial scholars show us, a result of a certain Western way of thinking, and inseparable from the history of colonialism and the making of capitalism and the modern world. Post-colonial geographers, in particular, write that the idea of the globe was an abstraction that divided up space into nations and races, ignoring cultural and historical differences. Feminist and post and decolonial historians have shown us how the idea of the globe was made possible from the early modern period in Europe by a change in the thinking of how we thought of nature. Scientific thinking separated nature from the people living in it. It was a disenchantment of our world, enabled by an abstract, mechanistic understanding of nature as something separate from the people and not as something brought into being together with those who live in and with it. So this separation of nature from its social, cultural, and spiritual connections was crucial in enabling Europe to extract resources all across the globe without caring about the societies that lived, or societies in it. The Argentinian feminist philosopher Maria Lugones writes that modernity became constituted by dichotomous knowledge in categories such as culture and nature, human and non-human, men and women, black and white, that built on this hierarchical logic of modern colonial capitalist thinking. The subject of this world, the norm, was the rational European white man. The philosophical basis of this world was the exercise of reason and the universality of rights, a new idea of statehood, and ultimately the nation. And the nation, as you know, is the artifice that makes up the global community that signed the Sustainable Development Goals, did the agreement on it. So sustainability, with its call to balance the economic, the environmental, and the social, might be seen as an effort to bridge these divides that we have today. However, as you saw, the Sustainable Development Goals have also been critiqued for reproducing a universal template grounded in Western and neoliberal thinking. Development has been criticized by many, and you've probably read that already, as a continuation of Western imperialism in the post-World War period. Through development, there was a will to improve those considered backward, oppressive, and patriarchal in the global South in the mold of the progressive North. The SDGs are seen by many as an extension of this universalist development thinking, promoted by the global North, supported by the elites in the global South, and built on what some have called a globally instituted neoliberalism. Critical scholars have called for disengaging with current systems altogether. Mignolo, an influential proponent of decolonial theory, calls to disengage with structures of development. He has argued that the aim of decolonial thought is to show that most people who are oppressed and racialized do not think in terms of, and neither do they care about things like universal human rights, which are based on an imperial view of humanity. He, including several others, looked to indigenous and subaltern epistemologies alternative to modern capitalist modernity. But what is Western as opposed to subaltern or indigenous, and how can we think of justice in various contexts? It is important not to forget that non-Western worlds played an important part in what we call, what is modernity today. Modernity, or science, as well as we know it, is not merely European. It was developed in relations with the global South. Although it is a history of nature and science built on racial and gendered relations, it was the work of many authors in different parts of the world. What we know of botany and taxonomy today, for example, this book is from Linné, who's the father of botany. Much of it was built on the work of thousands of unnamed men and women from the colonies of imperial powers, although it is not they who are acknowledged as the scientists. Nor did these relationships end just there, and continued in the 19th century and have continued and beyond. As Subir Sinha writes, that Global South struggles and movements played a constituent role in forging the modernity we inhabit today. Not only because of their resistance to dominant elites, but also positively, with their ways of seeing and imagining the world as well as the notions of a just society. So, for example, contrary to Mignolo, whom I spoke about earlier, the concept of rights or even human rights cannot just be ascribed to Western thinking. And political scientists like Sumi here have questioned the idea that these rights originate solely in Western thought. And she brings attention to how vernacular rights cultures across the world, as for instance, these women protesting here, have transformed constitutions and political imaginaries when it comes to rights. In a similar vein, in northern Sweden, we found that indigenous groups in our work there, threatened with mining on their lands, drew on a mix of knowledge systems and normative systems like international UN agreements, national law, as well as customary rights to make space for indigenous cosmologies and their rights and claims. In India, in my work in Orissa with women's groups, including with indigenous women, the use of the term women's rights was ubiquitous. When I asked them what they meant with it, they didn't really know the English term or its history, but they knew that they had more heft if they used it to define the ways they thought of rights and their claims and how they shaped their claims. So this is an important point that I want you to hold on to, this intertwining and inseparability of knowledge production and its practice in the world. And I believe it makes it, I think, difficult to jettison current thinking and structures without then losing many parts of many other worlds. In any case, to my mind, this makes it difficult also to say Western or not non-Western. It is difficult to disengage and disentangle not only everyday relations on the ground, but also in our thinking. Given all this, how do we then conceptualize other worlds and ensure that we transition with justice? And here is a slight diversion with what I mean with justice. So I think of justice in three ways. Firstly, justice is always contextual, plural, and an ongoing process. For this, I draw on the work of Amartya Sen, Etienne Balibar, Iris Marion, a very eclectic group. Justice is not the same for everyone and everywhere. It is important to focus on what happens on the ground, that is in relations to people's actual experiences, especially those of the marginalized, and their sense of what is fair. Also, as pointed out especially by feminist philosopher Iris Marion Young, justice is a process of struggles against injustice. So neither justice nor democracy are static. Both need constant maintenance. It is also here that we can see the relationship between democracy and justice. For democracy widens through calls and claims for attaining or ensuring justice. Secondly, it's important to keep in mind the frame of justice, that is, the political space in which decisions are made, especially in times of climate transitions. In the globe that we inhabit, the nation state is usually the container for justice, responsible for justice. That is for its citizens. But as Nancy Fraser points out, networked governance dislocates the frame in which this idea of Western justice is conventionally conceptualized by moving it beyond the nation state. Climate governance epitomizes the shifting of this frame of justice. Much of the decision-making on climate projects is carried out by an assemblage of international and national bureaucrats, policymakers, private interests, non-governmental actors, so diverging interests at different scales, and who all question this division between the domestic and the international. These assemblages are sites of negotiation over what counts as sustainable development, and it's partly through their practices that what is justice or democracy get articulated for people on the ground. But they have little accountability for the people, as people's claims to justice are still within the purview of the nation states. And as I go on to show in my first fragment. And the third way I think of justice is in relation to the importance of paying attention to its many borders and also its connections. So to borrow a phrase from Etienne Balibar, this justice has many borders. him and others write that justice is addressed only by addressing the other. That is, going beyond the norm and addressing its multiple borders. In other words, for justice to be realized, we must look at how it works or fails at the borders, where people are marginalized, such as migrants, the poor, or stateless individuals. It is how those at the edges are treated. I believe further, it's also important to keep in mind how these borders are connected to each other, often in unequal relationships. For example, actors who speak of justice in one forum can disregard it or in fact reinforce it in others. And to give you an example, the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27 in Egypt, the climate meet, was considered to be a victory for the governments in the global south. The international community agreed to establish a fund for countries in the global south most affected by climate change, including in India. This commitment to climate change by Indian officials claiming justice in this forum did not necessarily translate to justice for people living in the many forest areas and farms in India who continue to be evicted from their lands for minerals and resources for sustainable development. In fact, and the book that Sumi was talking about, there's several chapters by young scholars who've been working out in the field, who have been writing on that. In fact, there are innumerable stories, both from the global north and south, of people being evicted from their lands for climate projects. So to reiterate, justice is contextual, plural, and ongoing. The frame of justice is shifting, and this plurality is often connected in ways that is important to examine. And I now turn to the second part of my talk, the fragments of my research that show how justice or injustice can take shape in an entangled and interconnected world, and what it might mean for sustainability and the globe. So the first one is on REDD+. I carried out research with colleagues on climate projects in countries in Africa, in Burkina Faso and Tanzania in particular. We studied REDD+ projects. So REDD+ is reducing, it's a climate program, it's reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. Put very simply, villagers in the global south, in these projects, villagers in the global south were paid cash by the global north to not log their forests in order to sequester carbon. In these programs, we see two things happening in relation to the notion of the globe. So the programs build on the notion of a globe, that there is a globe and climate change is a global problem, and sequestration is seen as most cost-effective to address in countries in the global south. The REDD+ programs were seen as mitigating climate change and alleviating poverty through the cash that climate projects would bring in for the local people. And for the global north, it provided a cost-effective solution for its responsibility to cut down on carbon buildup caused by years of industrial development. Gender equality was seen as an important co-benefit. For example, in Burkina Faso, the promotion of women's work with non-timber forest products, which is like the shea nuts, was written into the REDD+ programs as a way, documents as a way to replace men's access to timber in the forest. The programs were presented as a win-win solution for everybody: carbon mitigation for the global north, poverty alleviation, and women's empowerment. In fact, they used to call it win-win-win because there are three wins. However, as ours, as well as a huge amount of research has already demonstrated, this is not quite how carbon forestry programs have worked. They have in fact led to land grabbing and loss of livelihoods. Payments have been delayed, calculating them have been complicated, and these programs have immense justice and ethical concerns. But that's not what I'm going to go into. What I will talk about here is that these programs need to be seen, and in fact they are a form of global climate citizenship, and citizenship, is both rights, it constitutes both rights and responsibilities. So what did this climate citizenship mean for people's rights and responsibilities in Tanzania and Burkina Faso? And justice for all those men and women who could no longer access the forests for their livelihoods, but are required to protect them in return for promises of cash. So in our studies, we saw only the responsibility of citizenship, where the villagers were responsible for giving up their claims to the forests and responsible for protecting them. There was a scant discussion of their rights or claims for justice, which is the other side of citizenship. That this was a win-win situation for them was just assumed. In fact, there were people from NGOs going around showing films, telling them how their work was so important because they would make the rain come and basically help the whole world in that way. For the villagers, carbon forestry implied becoming dependent on cash from an uncertain and volatile carbon market over which they had no control. The villagers' rights to land, or villagers' rights, and then, for example, to land, became contingent on an economic transaction based on an abstract measure, which was carbon, and in relation to a diffuse climate assemblage of NGOs, World Bank officials, and others. Though it was the men's work in the forest that was curtailed, they could no longer log or make charcoal, which is what they usually did. The women were equally, if not more, actually severely affected. Apart from their care work, they now had increasing pressure on them to provide for the family from their work with the non-timber forest products like shea in Burkina, or from the agricultural plots in Tanzania. They were meant to replace the men's income from the forests. So decision-making on the environment moved upwards to a global level, but responsibility for taking care moved down in very gendered ways. There was a shift of burden of the actual environmental labor to the poor and especially to women. So the new International Division of Climate Labor was premised on women's work in the forests and the farms. And these climate assemblages, all these different people, all the bureaucrats and the others in the programs, they are having state-like effects. Villagers are drawn into this assemblage and subject to new identifications. They're responsible environmental citizens, meant to look after the forest for the global good. And the forests and village spaces are becoming a global commons. Now, scholars have, in general, conceptualized a global citizenship in very positive terms, as cultivating a cosmopolitan outlook with the moral duty to care about what happens in the world. My argument here is that there is actually already a global citizenship in practice, in terms of the responsibilities of these villagers to preserve forests for the global good. This, I argue, is the dark side of a global citizenship, a citizenship mediated by a climate assemblage and contingent on carbon markets. There was no corresponding discussion on the responsibility of international policymakers or organizations in making these life-changing decisions for people on the ground. So critics have demanded that such programs of carbon trading and offsetting need to end, and they've called to dismantle this architecture. But this is also where I think the remaking becomes possible. I would argue that we need to understand the terms of the citizenship process, which in fact it is, and identify the working of the shadowy climate architecture, not merely to bypass it, which I think is impossible at this stage, considering the focus on this internationally. We need to use it to open up new emancipatory spaces by conceptualizing rights beyond just the responsibilities of this global citizenship. So there is a need also to make the various actors involved, including private interest, responsible for justice. Taking away this architecture, I think, would not take these interests away. And I'm a historian, and I think history tells us that these interests would just move off elsewhere. So I think we need to pin them down and make them responsible. So this brings me to the second example. I continue on the theme of this assemblage of bureaucrats, aid workers, climate experts, and policymakers, but now turn the gaze to Europe. So in this work, I compared how justice and democracy is imagined by Swedish officials and policies on sustainable development and the climate in Sweden, with how Swedish bureaucrats do that in the global south through their development aid. So I studied how SEPA officials, which is the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, deals with questions of gender and democracy in their policies and projects, in contrast to officials within SIDA, which is the Swedish International Development Agency. So I analyzed policy documents, carried out ethnographic work. In both these organizations conducted interviews and attended meetings and so on. And in case you're wondering, I realized this is a Janus face, which will become apparent why I have it. So I found that while there was a great deal of talk about democracy and justice, that is both people's participation and gender equality in CEDA's policies and projects, in fact, attention to gender equality was mandatory in all projects. A corresponding attention to gender and participation was completely absent in policies on the environment and climate in Sweden. In everyday practice, CEDA officials related that they insisted on meetings and people's participation in their projects in the Global South and on the presence of women in these various committees.
It's my iPad going off.
They often highlighted how it was important to make notions, to bring notions of gender equality to these Global South contexts for which Sweden was known so well. It was impossible to see what happened on the ground, but from the interviews at least, it was clear that for the development aid officials working abroad, it was very acceptable that people and their cultures needed to be included in environmental discussions and that gender was important to address. When I wondered about this absence in Sweden, I was told by some of the SEPA officials, mostly foresters and biologists, that their work had to do with the protection of nature. Besides, Sweden was already a democratic country, unlike the ones where the CEDA officials worked in. And there were other institutions in Sweden that took care of social problems. It was not their mandate. In interviews with SEPA field staff, however, some acknowledged that an attention to gender and inclusion more broadly would have enabled them to address tricky questions in the field and do a better job. But the absence of this mandate made it difficult for them to justify spending time and funding on these issues. So this disregard of dimensions of difference has a significance for what happens on the ground. In my research with women's groups in villages in Sweden, women's critiques of being excluded from environmental decision making was often disregarded by practitioners and others as the dissatisfaction of a few disgruntled women. So when I raised concerns, I was told by my colleagues working with the village committees on democratizing forest governance that this was not the Global South. Gender was not the same thing here. What's more, they believed that raising the question of gender differences would hurt the larger cause of forest democracy. Politicians might use the women's claims to undermine the men's efforts for local governance by calling them out as unjust. So you can see how the borders of justice are connected here in paradoxical ways. They pointed out to me, the gender mafia, that all the women needed to do was to attend the meetings and raise their voices if they wanted to have their voices heard. The women pointed out to me that they could raise their voices, but nobody listened. So ideas about Swedish gender equality among my colleagues were echoed in policymaking. Here is a quote dated from a Swedish government memorandum on gender equality that kind of epitomizes this thinking. And they write, "We in Sweden have come a long way compared with other nations. Yes, in fact, we are far ahead of the rest of the world. We are glad to share our experiences. We are glad to export our Swedish model for gender equality. But this, our first place, should not lead us to think that we are done. As yet, there is a lot to be done in many areas." So there are lots of other quotes like that from politicians, which I haven't put, but things have changed since 1999, and there is no longer a ministry for gender equality. But the idea of being far ahead in gender equality, democracy, and the environment is very strong in Sweden. So what all this research showed me is that this conviction of being so good at gender equality, democracy, and so on in mainstream discourse and in policy helps to make discrimination invisible and ignore claims to justice at home. And this is also the case in relation to the curtailed right of the Sami indigenous people in Sweden, as I show in my next research fragment. So the logic of being far ahead of others continues to justify action in new arenas and new times. Sweden's green transition rests on the conviction that technological solution, renewable energy, and industry will deliver sustainability, much like the quote from the EU that I showed you earlier. Northern Sweden, where we work, is the site of huge new industrial investments that are meant to pave the way for a green transition. Rural inhabitants, and in particular the Sami indigenous people, see their lands being taken over for sustainable mining. They call them sustainable mining, and other interventions such as wind power farms and for the benefit of the green transition. This has resulted in huge conflicts in rural areas. But here too, politicians mobilize the idea of the globe and Sweden's moral superiority in environmental issues and democracy to promote industrial interests. For example, when the former Minister of Industry was asked by a journalist about the appropriation of Sami indigenous lands and widespread protests in Sweden against mining and claims for justice, he said, here's a quote from him, "You have owners' interests, the Sami interests, and all kinds of environmental interests that are poised against our need of this transition. Nobody dreams about having a mine as a neighbor, but I think that most realize that we're going to need these metals. Then the question is, are we going to step up and take on the responsibility? I think everyone is horrified when we see how cobalt is mined in Congo, or if we hear about miners dying in other countries because the conditions are not safe. It is clear that we as a country have to take responsibility for this, especially since we are a country that want to show that our transition is good for the economy and people." So politicians across the board have expressed horror about conditions in the cobalt mines. The image of children in the mines in Congo has become a trope that's used everywhere. So in interviews and public meetings at our study sites in northern Sweden, local politicians pushing for mines in the area often remind the audience about the children in the mines in Congo. So while conditions in Swedish mines are no doubt much better than in many other countries, the horror at the lack of good governance and injustice in other countries is being used to justify the territorialization of land belonging to indigenous communities in Sweden and to ignore justice and rights at home. Mining is motivated by economic and environmental arguments, by the need for raw metals and sustainable technologies from the rare earth metals, but also through calls to moral superiority and racial responsibility for the rest of the globe. For the Sami, the takeover of land for mining hurts not only reindeer herding, which they do, but other economic activities. It also entails a transformation of the landscape, their culture, and lives. A Sami woman remarked to my colleague, Arvid Schenström, she said, "It is state policy that legitimizes interventions on land. Policies decide, now we will do this, and that is for that, and so on. That is an exercise of power. For us, it is definitely something to think about. Who can define this place, and who can define Sapmi?" Sapmi is the indigenous land all across the northern hemisphere. "And who has done so throughout history and here in this place? All the interventions that have taken place, we are not even represented or allowed to raise our voices, although we have always lived here." So the interesting question is, who has the right to define the place, who can do it, and what tools do we have? So the worlds of Sami indigenous peoples, their ways of knowing and being in nature are rendered invisible in these many climate and development interventions and plans. Their livelihoods, such as reindeer herding, when they are mentioned, are described as an economic activity and reduced to a business and not a way of life and culture, which they are. So clearly, questions of justice and democracy remain unaddressed. The place itself is abstracted from the Sami, who have lived and taken care of it for millennia. So the conclusion that I draw from all these studies is that in environmental and climate governance, citizens in Sweden are abstract entities devoid of history, ethnicity, gender, or race, that climate change will be solved by green technologies and economic instruments, and that environments are areas without people living in them. Nature is a resource and not the basis of the enchanted world of everyday relations with human and non-human beings. So the imagined absence of humans then makes justice a non-question. All this is underpinned by a taken for granted assumption that we are already democratic and equal. Democracy is kind of static. We don't have to worry about that, as opposed to all the others who have to do it in the global south. The point that I want to emphasize is that by establishing this epistemological superiority abroad, it has negative implications, not only for the global south, as is often discussed in the literature, but also for governance within the global north, or in Sweden in this case. It paves the ground for displacing claims for justice as questions that concern other people and for ignoring them at home. Claims that are going to continue to fragment European polities. So in all three fragments that I've presented so far, on carbon forestry, on Swedish policy and practice, and on the transition, ideas about the globe, as you can see, were very apparent and used to assign responsibility, separate the environment from the people, define the places, and pay short shrift to justice and thus to sustainability. And in all these fragments, close attention to the connections and borders of justice brings to light the invisible others, that is, who is always a part of someone else's development. For example, the women in the Swedish villages meant to curb their claims for what the men called the bigger struggle for forest democracy, discourses about patriarchal global south context that close down space for claims to justice in the global north, villagers in the global south meant to clean our global atmosphere because how empowering it would be for them, and indigenous lands across the globe to be seeded for sustainable transitions, especially in Sweden, where we have good governance. So now I come to the third and last part of my talk by going back to the questions with which I started. How do we go about ensuring that we transition with justice? And how do we conceptualize and take action for new worlds? In the quest to work towards new worlds, we can only make new worlds from the fragments of what we have. While radical scholars have looked to subaltern and grassroots thinking for change, gender scholars in particular can testify to how these two can reproduce inequalities. Also, instruments of liberal democracy and the nation state are called upon by subaltern groups, such as the women's groups I spoke about earlier and the indigenous groups in Sweden for their rights. So rather than dismantling or ignoring climate and sustainability frameworks, I ask, can we leverage them to create more just worlds? What if world making begins with remaking, using existing infrastructures to ensure accountability, justice, and democratic participation, but also working to disengage from the oppressive practices they promote? So what do we have to do that? We do have the idea of the globe, and we have a global architecture. And the urgency of climate change and all these other crises have forced us to think over borders. I believe that the framework of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs is actually an important point of departure that could be used across these many borders. The process of defining the SDGs was regarded as an unusually inclusive process, given the global arena, within the limitations of global arenas. It included civil society, activists, academics, and all of whom saw to it that the language of justice and human rights were part of the agenda. In an article that I wrote in 2023 on the SDGs, I suggested thinking about them and using them not as final, but as spaces and platforms to think and work from. Something like Pratt's contact zones, as dynamic and conflictual spaces where different groups can interact, contest climate and development and democracy. The indicators that have been at the center of acrimonious disputes could be used as not a number to reach, which they are right now, but as what Beckett calls fictional expectations, and also a site for debate. For example, the rights of the people in Tanzania and Burkina Faso. This would be one place to debate that. So the SDGs as contact zones offer the possibility for local claims to meet and local imaginaries and collective imaginaries to be constructed, where democracy and justice are debated in this jigsaw world, and dominance is challenged. And actually, to some extent, this is already taking place. For example, in the past, development was always something that for the global south in the mold of the global north. Now, for the first time, with the language of sustainability, the global north is being brought into the discussion as a subject of development and needing to change. In his book on the SDGs, Aram Zai cites a respondent from the global south as saying, if we adopt the concept of sustainability, the industrialized countries are developing countries. And initial attempts, and this has been shown as initial attempts to create indicators of progress have proved this right. There have been notable challenges for global north countries when it comes to fulfilling several SDGs on the environment, on agricultural systems, on consumption, and so on. So So this would mean abandoning the assumption of the North as the norm. So in the new and shifting geopolitical climate, the agenda provides a space where North-South binaries, rather than being reaffirmed, can be challenged. Also, my research across different parts of the globe have shown me that there are dissident knowledges, not only at the margins, but also among the bureaucrats that I interviewed. These provide important openings for a decolonial future. In fact, several CEDA bureaucrats, inspired by their work on community participation in the countries in the global south, did in fact manage to lobby and include the question of local democracy in some parts of Swedish environmental legislation. For policymakers in Sweden, learning from the global south would also mean using criteria they already use there in Sweden, bringing in gender, indigeneity, and other dimensions of power in environmental and climate projects. This would mean taking stock of policymaking's colonial, gendered, and class biases and working with them. Remaking the architecture also means demanding accountability from global institutions and private interests. Climate programs have been rightfully criticized by many. But given that private interests are central in climate action today and that climate markets are dominant, I think it makes it important for us not just to engage with them beyond theoretical denunciations of the system and the structures in which we found ourselves. And studies are beginning to show how social protection initiatives like in Ethiopia and some in India that do exist can play a powerful role in building climate resilient communities. So engaging in the politics with private interests and carbon markets may make the space for political agency of women and men. So what if we work to find ways to ensure accountability by the climate assemblages, and what if rights and social protections would be part and parcel of all climate and development? And in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that climate change isn't won by one bold move, but by thousands of small actions in the everyday. So to create new worlds, let's start with the fragments of what we have. Let's use the tools at our disposal, the policies, the institutions, and the global frameworks to reshape them and remake the globe where social justice is central. Let's engage critically and imagine boldly. And before I end, I would like to say some of these, you might have noticed some of this artwork by Amy Flynn. And she makes, and in keeping with the theme of this talk, she makes things with sculptures from recycled material, and she calls them phobots, so found material robots. And this particular one is called Greta. And funnily, she made this, and I thought it was so nice because it could be Greta nurturing the globe. And she made this long before Greta took the boat to Gaza, even. So.